All right, hello everyone, and welcome to week 3 of the DMARC Bootcamp. Again, my name is Shahzad Mirza, and I'll be leading you through the remainder of these courses. So just as a reminder to folks, so if you do have any questions, feel free to post those questions in the questions box, and we'll be happy to answer those questions as best as we can, either during the session or most likely after the session. Also, as a reminder, folks, too, there are 3 sessions this week. You do not need to attend all 3. So if you attend this one to its completion, no need to attend the rest if you're looking just to get the certificate. If you're looking to just learn more, you're more than welcome to attend all 3. And what we're going to be doing in today's session is going to talk about the DMARC policy and focus on the DMARC policy, the tags and the values of each tags and what each of the tags mean. And that's the thing that we're going to be doing for the other sessions as well. The sessions on the 19th and the 20th. The first half will be that. It's the second half that's going to be different. So in today's session, the second half is going to be a demonstration of implementing SPF, DKIM, and DMARC using Windows DNS. Right. The session on the 19th, which is tomorrow, that will be doing the demonstration using a Linux or bind server. And then on the 20th, the demonstration will be using a cloud DNS. So that's why you don't have to attend all 3. If you want to, you're more than welcome to, but you may want to come in, join a little bit late, just so you don't have to hear the first half over and over again. But again, you're welcome to attend all 3 for the full sessions if you choose to. And you will get reminder emails. Unfortunately, that's the way the system works, and we can't stop those. So you will get reminder emails for the ones over the next 2 days as well. So let's go ahead and get started here. So what we're talking about today is going to be the focusing on DMARC policy, right? When it comes to DMARC, there's the 2 parts, the DMARC policy and there's DMARC verification. The DMARC policy is what you, as a domain owner, needs to set up and implement on for your organization, right? So this is something you got to set up and configure on your DNS. For your public DNS, on your public DNS system. So you as a sending organization, you as the domain owner are going to create that DMARC policy to protect your domain and protect your brand. The other side, the receiving side, is where they're going to deal with DMARC verification. So with DMARC verification, that's something they have to enable or turn on the system in order to do so, right? So that's where they will go into the email security gateway. They'll go into their email security systems and use that to focus on and turn on the DMARC verification and turn on whatever options that they are using. So DMARC verification is not going to be the focus here today because that's something that's different on each of the systems. It's usually just you find the section for incoming policies or incoming messages, turn on DMARC verification and set up whatever options are available. But it's so different on comparing like an iReport to a Mimecast, to how Symantec does it, how McAfee does it, and so on. So what you really need to do for that is go focus and look at what your vendor documentation gives you, right? Or even ask customer support and ask them, hey, look, we want DMARC verification enabled. What are the steps or actions that I need to take to turn it on? In some cases, they'll help you out and they'll turn it on for you. Some cloud service providers have it on by default. So Office 365 and Google Workspace, they have DMARC verification enabled by default, so you don't have to worry about it. So they actually have it in place. But if you do have like a gateway in front of that, enable it on the gateway as well, just as another level of protection. So there's just a quick question here. What if a receiver does not have DMARC verification method? Do they still get the message, or are they required to have it? The messages will still go through, even if they don't have DMARC verification on. The only downfall or downside to it is they obviously can't check for DMARC, right? That's the only issue that you're going to deal with there. So DMARC, the DMARC policy you'll have in place to protect your domain, but you're not going to be able to have a way to check other domains to see if there's a DMARC policy applied to it. But a majority of these tools should have DMARC verification in place, and they need to turn it on. If they don't have it turned on, then again, messages will just go through all the other filters that are in place. Just DMARC checks are going to be skipped. So there's a question about Office 365 using DMARC. I'll show you actually the demonstration we're going to do is actually going to be with Office 365. So we'll hold off into that. So things that you need for implementation. So a lot of this, most of this is going to be stuff that you need for SPF and DKIM mainly, like knowing your mail servers or servers that are used to send mail for the organization, right? That's going to be more for SPF and DKIM. So should you have SPF and DKIM in place before you implement DMARC? It doesn't hurt. It's not a bad idea to have it, because if you do that, it actually reduces the clutter and reduces the noise that is generated in the reports. But you can actually implement DMARC at the lowest level without SPF and DKIM in place, and then it can add SPF and DKIM as you go along, and then add that and then change your DMARC policies accordingly. But things you also need to have, or you should have, is access to your DNS. Why? Because that's where you're creating your DMARC policy, right? So it's access to public DNS, not your private DNS. Then private DNS is meant for internal usage. Public DNS, the public facing, is the one that everyone's going to go to check out information about your domain, how to get to your website, and so on. You should also really have a list of all of your domains, not just subdomains, but all of your domains, all your public facing domains, right? So if you have a top level domain, if you have sub level domains that are all public facing, make sure you have a list of those. And then not only have that list, but also determine which ones are used for email, which ones are not used for email, right? Because you can actually define and protect the ones that are not used for email right off the bat. Those are easy wins. You can put, and I'll show you again in the demonstration what you can do to get that easy win, right? Because you don't want people using those domains that are not being used for email. It's like if you're not using it for email, then nobody else should be using it for email either. So that's why you need to protect those domains as well from attackers and spam usage. So have that list if you can get that list together for yourselves. If you can't, the nice thing about some of these, the reports, the DMARC reports that get generated, the subdomains should appear in those as well, if they're being used. Now, in DNS, what you're going to be creating is a TXT record, right? A TXT record. And that TXT record you're going to define, you do have to give it a name. And the name is going to be _DMARC. Right, that's required. There's no choice on that, because this is what's going to give and let other domains know that this is your domain's DMARC policy. So _DMARC, and DMARC in lowercase. After that, you don't, depending on the type of DNS you're using, you may or may not have to add your full domain name, right? And again, that's why we're going to do those demonstrations, so I can show you which ones will and which ones won't, and what the situation is in that scenario. So we'll see how does a Windows machine handle this, or Windows DNS handle this. So always start _DMARC. That's the name of the record. Then you're going to define your value. So the value is what's going to be your actual policy, right? That's where you're defining the authentication, the conformance levels, the reporting values that you want to enable and turn on in the value. So the V equals, P equals, RUA, and so on. These are the things we're going to focus on in these next few slides, as to what do they mean, why do you need them, what they're going to do for you by putting these in, which ones are required, which ones are recommended, which ones are optional. Okay, so these are all the things that we're going to go through and define these so that we can help you create that DMARC policy that you need to put into place. So the first tag that has to be present, and it has to be first. Right? This can't be at the end, this can't be in the middle, it can't be second. It has to be the very first tag, which is V equals DMARC1, right? The V equals is defining the version of DMARC that you're using, right? There is no other DMARC version, there's always DMARC1. And they did this in case, if they make changes or modifications, or if they do any enhancements, they can do a versioning control of it. So they put this in. Right now, there's no talks of having a DMARC 2 or 3 or anything like that. Then they may make adjustments to it, but they'll probably stick with just V equals DMARC 1. So always start with V equals DMARC 1. Now each tag is also separated by a semicolon. So you're going to see this in the examples as we go along. So it'll be V equals DMARC 1, semicolon, and then the next tag, semicolon, the next tag, and so on and so forth. All right, so always start with V equals DMARC 1. Now, That is required, so that's a must. And the other tag that's required is the P tag. All right, the P tag is defining your policy that you're applying to your domain, right? So if you remember from week 1, we had 3 levels for our policy. We have none, quarantine, and reject. So you put one of those in. You can't put in multiple, it's only one. So the only options are none, quarantine, and reject. I've seen cases where people also put in another P equals monitored or monitor. That doesn't exist anymore. It was something that was there in the past. That's an old deprecated value for the P tag. So it's only none, quarantine, or reject. Right. So if you're using something else other than that, your policy is incorrect and your policy is not functional. And I'll explain what each one means in a second. Now, the other thing about the P tag is also that it not only applies to your top level domain, but by default, it applies to all your subdomains as well. Right, so you can put in a value of P equals reject. That reject applies to your top level and all your subdomains. So you don't have to worry about trying to protect them. Right, you don't have to worry about trying to protect those domains because you could just do it right at the top level domain. Right, so the P tag applies to top level domain and to all of your subdomains automatically. So what are each one of these? What are the policy settings mean? How are they defined? So if you have P equals none, you're basically putting yourself into monitored only mode, right? So you're basically saying here, like, look, I'm working on my DMARC policy. I'm working on my email authentication mechanisms. I don't think, I still have to work on SPF. I still have to work on DKIM. Got to get all those put into place. But send me reports, right? So just to be clear, though, the non-quarantine, the P tag does not define or turn on reports. The P tag just defines the conformance level, and that's it. Okay? So the P tag does not turn on reports. There's another tag that does reports, and that's going to be on the next slide. But so at none, you're just saying that don't apply the DMARC policy, don't enforce a policy, treat your messages and let them go through all the other filters, but ignore DMARC verification because I need to make sure everything is set up correctly. But you want to get those reports so that we can make those adjustments that you need to SPF and DKIM in alignment, right? Because when you're at quarantine or reject, if those checks fail, so if all the checks fail, at quarantine, the message goes to the spam junk folder. At reject, the message doesn't get delivered at all, right? So this is why you have to be careful, and this is why you want to enable reporting mechanisms on this. So if you have this first option here, where if you just go v equals DMARC1 semicolon, p equals none semicolon, yeah, you have a DMARC policy, but that means nothing because you're not doing anything. How do you know if your SPF and DKIM and your alignments and things are set up correctly? You don't. You have to go more than that. So just having P equals none does nothing for you. You have to enable the reporting, and so that's going to be very important and very key from this, right? So this is why it's important to start off with P equals none and then work your way up to reject. Don't just jump to reject either, because if you don't know what your environment's like and there are things missing, you're gonna have a problem, right? So that's why you want to have a safeguard. Stay at none for maybe a week or two. In some cases, people have stayed 3 months at none just because they don't. Newsletters are sent on a quarterly basis, so they want to make sure that the newsletter gets sent correctly, and then they can take the reports and make sure everything is set up correctly. So it really depends on your environment and how quickly you should move to reject or consider moving to reject. Now, RUA and RUF. These are the tags you're going to use to enable reporting, right? So after, so V tag is first, P tag, sorry, one more thing about the P tag. The P tag has to be second also, right? The P tag does need to be second in your DMARC policy. I've seen cases where people have put the P tag in like third or fourth or towards the end, and they say, oh, it still works. Yeah, it may still work, but it's not going to work for all DMARC verification tools. Majority of DMARC verification tools are looking for the P tag as the second tag, right? Because the RFC for DMARC says the P tag should be the second tag. So when the vendors, when they went to DMARC verification, they said look for V equals first, look for the P tag second, and then look for everything else after that. So make sure you do have the P tag as your second tag, right? Because it won't work on all the systems, but if you want to get all the systems, make sure the P tag is correctly placed in the second spot. okay? So V equals first and then P equals. After that, the tags can go in any order, right? The order after that doesn't matter. Just make sure you do it correctly and have the semicolons in the right spot, okay? So you have to add the RUA tag and the RUF tag in order to enable and turn on reporting, right? Because like I said, V equals DMARC1 semicolon, P equals non-semicolon. All you're doing is defining the compliance standard, but not defining where to send the reports to. So you have to do that. So RUA is going to be for aggregate reports. That's the one you really want to get. So technically, both of these are optional, right? But it is highly recommended that you have RUA. That's we're from GCA standpoint saying that it's required to have that in place. Okay, especially if you have P equals none. Have it. You're saying required to have it because you're not doing anything. You're not doing anyone any benefit, even your own organization, by not having the RUA tag in there. So aggregate reports, why that one's so important, and I'm going to go into more detail with it next week. But the RUA, the aggregate report, is the one that's going to give you all that information about who's sending using your domain, legitimate and fraudulent systems, what's happening with SPF, DKIM, passing, failing, alignment, and what's happening with in terms of the DMARC aspect of it. That's why those reports are important. So the way you set this up is RUA equals mail to colon, and then an email address that you want to send the messages to. Right? So the email address that you want to send the messages to. For RUF, it's forensic failure reports. So this is a different type of report. Technically, it's actually a message. It's the actual email message itself that failed. So it failed some check, right? Whether it be SPF or DKIM or failed alignment, that's why you got this report back. Or not really the email itself back. So we're going to talk about some issues with the RUF because you may not get the RUF reports from everybody. There's privacy issues and privacy concerns. But again, we'll talk about it next week in more detail. But it is still recommended. Still consider setting up RUF because if you do get some of those, you might get some. You might get some information that might help you figure out what are some of the issues that are going on with SPF or DKIM and the signing and alignment and things like that. Because those messages will actually have the full email header in there. So to do that, so you put in RUF equals mail to colon and then the email address that you want to send those two reports to. Right? So those are the way you would do it. So now you can send to multiple email addresses if you choose to. Right? So you can send, if you want to send it to multiple, so if you want to send these aggregate reports to 2 or 3 or 4 email addresses, you can do so by putting in RUA equals mail to colon, the first email, comma, mail to colon, the second email, comma, mail to colon, the third email. Right, so you can send to multiple email addresses. Do not, so unlike the SPF, right? In SPF you had include colon the domain, include colon the domain. This is not how it works in DMARC. DMARC you can only use the tag once, but you can have multiple values. So RUA equals mail to colon email, comma, mail to colon email, and then semicolon. All right, so that's something that you can use, and you can same thing with RUF if you want to just use a separate them by the comma. But make sure the mail to colon is in front of each of the email addresses. Otherwise, it's not going to send the mail to that message to that. The other thing is that 2 other things. So one, don't put in more than 3 or 4 email addresses because what we've seen historically that if you have too many emails in there, the reports may not get to those last few. Right, so they may not get all the reports because most of these DMARC verification tools looked about 3 or 4 emails in. So use only a few. And if you can, this is the second point, use a generic email address, right? dmarc@company.com. Or if you want to go as far as saying, you can say dmarc-rua@company.com and dmarc-ruf@company.com. So some people do separate the 2 out. So that's really up to you on how you want to do it. You know, if you want to send to one single address, that's fine. If you want to separate those 2 out, you can do so. I mean, and you can really tell the difference between 2 reports. The RUA reports come as a zipped attachment, whereas the RUF are the actual full message itself. So you can tell the difference, but you know, some people like to separate it out, and that's really up to you. And you should really use a generic account, right? Because remember, these DMARC policies that you're creating, These are on your public DNS. So that means anyone can search for your DMARC record, right? People can run scans. We've run scans to see what the DMARC value is of different domains if they have one, right? And then that way in the email, if you're using your work or actual personal work email account, other people can see it, and then it could lead to other types of situations like spammers and things like that going to your messages. Use a generic account so that way you're not, and plus the fact that these reports, you can get a large amount of reports. It's best to send it to a generic account and then give people access to the account that need to be able to read or review those reports. The other thing to take into account is also the reports can only be by default sent to an email address within the same domain you're creating the policy for. Right, that's how it is set up by default. You can technically send it to other domains, so an external email address if you choose to, but there are other requirements, right? The third party that you're going to send these reports to has to do some things on their end in order to accept the reports, right? This way you can't just spam anyone with your reports, right? You can't just inundate them with all your reports. They have to actually enable something on their end to be able to accept those reports. Okay, so those are things to take into account with both of these tags. So technically RUA and RUF are optional, but we're saying RUA required, use it because it's going to only benefit you in getting those reports. RUF, it's up to you, but we do recommend consider using it. Now the rest of these are completely optional. So optional meaning that even if you don't explicitly define it, so if you don't create the tag or put the tag right in the policy, the tag will actually, DMARC will use the default values for it unless you do that. So that's something you have to take into consideration when these are actually being used even though you're not defining them in your policy itself. And each of these slides will show you what the default value is as well for each of these tags that are present. So the first one is the FO tag. The FO tag. So this is only going to be used with forensic failure reports. So if you have the RUF tag set up and you're defining where the email address is, the email address to send the messages, then this is something that's going to be applicable. So what you're going to define you're going to define what's the trigger to send these failure reports. What are you triggering it on? Because you don't necessarily have to trigger it on everything. So every type of failure. Right, so your values are 0, 1, D, and S. So 0 is the default. So that means to generate the report if all underlying authentication mechanisms fail. So DKIM fails, SPF fails, alignment fails, send it over. So 1 is to generate a report if any underlying authentication mechanism produces something other than a line pass result. It's very similar to 0. So I mean, basically if it's failed on a line or anything like that, send it. So it's more along the lines for alignment. D is for DKIM, so only if DKIM fails. So DKIM fails, we always have the alignment set, trigger it, and S is for SPF. So trigger it if SPF if SPF is an issue. The next one is ADKIM and ASPF. Again, these are optional. You do not need to define these. If you do define these are going to be used to define what level of alignment mode should be set up for DKIM and SPF. Right? You don't have to use them both together. You choose one or the other, or don't define, or don't put either. You can put them both, put one, or put neither. It's up to you on how you want to use these. But the default values, so if you don't define it in the policy, the default value for both is going to be relaxed alignment. Your other option is S, which is strict alignment. Right? So what's the difference between the two? It basically means if you keep it at relaxed alignment. So if your DKIM domain or your SPF domain is using your top level domain, but the from address is using a subdomain, relaxed alignment will allow that to be accepted and allow it to be considered aligned, right? Because at least the domains are, it's not the exact match, but it's within the same parameters, meaning the same domain. So everything is fine. So whether it's the top level domain and sub level domain. Strict alignment means that it has to be the exact same domain, no variations whatsoever. Right, so if the DKIM domain says globalcyberalliance.org, the from address has to be globalcyberalliance.org. It can't be m.globalcyberalliance or sales.globalcyberalliance. It has to be specifically exactly Global Cyber Alliance there. So domains have to match letter for letter, and if you do strict alignment. So be careful with this one. right? The only time I've ever used seen a strict alignment is mainly for DKIM, right? Because in DKIM, I've seen about 99% of the time that the domain is always in alignment as long as DKIM is set up correctly. But the only way you get to know is if you get the reports, right? So if you get the reports are going to show you the alignment. If your alignment always shows your domain, and you always see your domain under the alignment, then you could then consider putting an ADKIM equals S and ASPF equals S. If you don't see that, then leave it by the default, then leave it as relaxed. All right. So there's a question about the FO. So the default for FO is 0. That's the 0. So FO equals 0 is the default if you don't specify it. So wherever you see default in the slides, that's what the default is. If you don't specify it, that's the value that it's going to be using. The next tags are RF and RI. So RF stands for report format, RI stands for reporting interval. Okay, so RF, report format. So there's two types of formats you can get these reports in. There's AFRF, which is the default value, and IODEF, which is another option that you have available to you. Right? I actually have never seen myself anyone use IODEF. Which one should you use? I would stick with the default unless you have like some sort of logging tool or some sort of SIM type tool that specifically says that you need it in IODEF. So it's just the type of format that it's in. Right, so we're not going to go into the format types because that in itself is, could take a full session. But I'm giving you the RSC value, so that way, if you really want to dig deep dive into it, you have the RSV values there, so you can take a look at it. Reporting interval is RI. So the RI tag is where you're defining how often these reports should be sent, right? How often these reports and what the time frame of those the data in that report is going to be. So and this really pertains more to the RUA tag because the aggregate report is an aggregate, right? So you're going to say that within a 24-hour period, which is the default, so 84,600 seconds, right? So that's important to note that the RI is in seconds. So don't put like 10 because that's every 10 seconds. So make sure you adjust it according. The default is 24 hours. So within a 24-hour period, you're going to get reports from various, recipient servers. And in that 24-hour period, in that report will be information within a 24-hour period of what that system has seen, what the receiving side has seen in terms of, what IP addresses are, SPF, DKIM, passing, failing, alignment, and DMARC values as well. So most cases I've only seen people actually lower the number, mainly because they're working on their DMARC, and then when they got the first initial reports, they saw that there was actually a large amount of spam activity for their domain. So they reduced the time so that way they can get reports quicker, and as they're making adjustments to SPF and DKIM on the back end. So as they're making adjustments, they can see the report. Okay, this looks like everything is working now. Everything is functional. Okay, now we can move up to quarantine or we can move up to reject at this point. All right, so if RI is not specified, the default is 84,600 seconds or 24 hours. The PCT tag, the percentage tag, this is also optional. So the value for the percentage tag can be anywhere between 0 and 100. And the default is 100. So 100%. So the percent tag or PCT tag is defining what percentage of messages are going to be impacted by this DMARC policy. Right? But the problem is that with this tag is that you can't define or decide which messages, which servers, those messages that you're applying the DMARC policy and which servers you're not going to apply the DMARC policy. There's no option in that. This is really up to the receiving end to make a decision or decide, okay, we're going to, this is the message we'll use, this is the message we won't do, the DMARC policy. So I'm still not convinced that, that this is a great tag to use. People have tried to explain it to me saying that, well, it's just a safeguard. that's great. It's a safeguard, but you can't just say if the legitimate message is going to be impacted or if the fraudulent message is going to be impacted when you use the PCT tag. So if you had more control over it, then I would say yes, use the PCT tag. But since you don't really have that level of control, I would say just leave it out. Don't use it. But again, that's really up to you on that. But just things to take into account with this: if you have your policy set to quarantine and you put PCT equals 0, that's the same thing as putting in P equals none. Right? And same thing if you're doing reject. If you do reject and your percentage level is 0, that's the same thing as doing quarantine. So it actually defaults back. So if you're going to use the PCT tag, don't use 0, use anything higher, 1 or higher, up to 100. The SP tag. So SP tag. So when I talked about the P tag, right? The P tag I said automatically applies to your top level domain and to all your sub level domains. Right? Now the thing is that there could be issues here. There can be some problems that happen, especially if you have subdomains that are being used for email. Right? So what they did was create an SP tag, because with the SP tag, you can actually say like, look, my top level domain is what the P tag is going to use, but for the sub level domains, this is going to be the policy that I'm going to apply to the sub level domains. Right, and it depends on the situation and where you're going to use this. Now, when you define the SP tag, it's the same values as the top level, as the P tag. So it's SP equals none, SP equals quarantine, or SP equals reject. Okay, but if you don't define the SP tag, it defaults using what the P tag setting is. So when should you consider using this? So if you're at P equals 9 and you know for a fact that you have no subdomains being utilized whatsoever in your for public use, or even if they're not used, again, they're not used for email, put in SP equals reject, because now you're protecting all those sub-level domains. So you can still protect globalcyberalliance.org, but no one can use m.globalcyberalliance.org. No one can use, whatever.globalcyberalliance.org. Right? And then this gives you time to focus on your top level domain and making the adjustments to SPF and DKIM and alignment and making sure everything is set up correctly. And we've seen cases that this happened. People are working on their P tag. They came back to us and said, hey, we're seeing traffic on here on using these tags. We don't have these domains. What can we do to protect these domains? So just put in SP equals reject, and it prevents all those from being used. Right? So that way you don't have to create a DMARC policy for every single variation of a subdomain. But then on the flip side, what if you are ready to go to reject and quarantine, but you do have subdomains, and those subdomains are actually being used for email purposes, right? Because if you go to P equals reject or P equals quarantine and those sub-level domains aren't ready yet, their messages are going to get rejected or quarantined, depending on what setting or what you implement. So this is why it's important. Then what you do here is you put in SP equals none in this scenario. Move your top level domain to quarantine or reject, and then put in SP equals none. So that way your sub-level domains, the policy is not being applied to them. And then for each of those sub-level domains that are being used for email, they will need to go in, put in their own SPF, put in their own DKIM record, and then create their own DMARC policy, right? And then they can change their DMARC policy to reject or quarantine, and that will override the top level domains policy. Right, so these are two scenarios where you need to take this into account and take into consideration. Okay, so the SP tag is optional, but something you do really need to consider using, and making sure you consider you think about whether it's useful for your environment or not. All right, so those are all the tags that are available to you. Right, so all you really need, if you look at the basic one, this is really all you need to get started. You just need the V tag, the P tag, the RUA and RUF, right? And then leave the rest, and then you can adjust the rest based, and then really consider the SP tag as well. But then leave the rest as they are, and then you can make those adjustments and changes as you need to at a later time, as you're fixing your SPF, as you're fixing your DKIM, and then you can consider these other ones as appropriate or as needed. But just to get started, use that V equals DMARC, P equals none, your RUA tag and RUF tags. All right, and you can do that even if you don't have SPF or DKIM in place, you can actually put in the policy level of none. It'll have zero impact on from the DMARC side. And then you can add your SPF and DKIM appropriately. Once those are all set, then you move your way to quarantine or reject. But there is benefit to doing SPF and DKIM first, because you can at least reduce the noise that can potentially be in those reports, especially when you're using a third-party provider. All right, so there's one question here, okay, maybe two now. I want to try to get these questions and then I'll go into the demonstration. So should we create a distro group or a purely separate email to receive aggregate reports? Will this be the same email we use to send forensic reports if they are sent? So in order to receive aggregate reports, my recommendation is create a distro group and use that, use that generic, because that's a generic email and everything else is hidden behind it. So just use a generic email account, really even just a generic inbox, with an email, send everything there and just give groups access to that instead of sending the messages directly to a distribution group. Really just create a separate email, put everything in that box, and then give the appropriate people access to the box to be able to review the reports. How big of a deal are spaces? Spaces aren't really that big of a deal. I mean, if you don't have a space there, if you put 2 spaces, you should still be fine. The benefit of the spaces is that it's easier to read. So just to confirm, if I have subdomains and don't put in the SP tag, the subdomain will use whatever is set to the P tag, correct? Yes, that's correct. If you do not define the SP tag will automatically use whatever the P tag is set to. All right, so let's go into the creation of the records. So there are quite a lot of questions about the report specifically. I'm going to ask that we wait until next week to give those answers. If you need an answer sooner than that, then please send me an email and then I'll answer the question. But for right now, for time purposes, I'm going to have you wait till next week, because next week we're going to go into detail about the RUA and the RUF reports, specifically on how to process them and how to review some of them. All right, so creating records. So let me switch here to my remote desktop. So we're going to switch over here and we're going to have a Windows machine here. It's a Windows DNS. All right, there we go. Let me just move some of these boxes. All right, so now just so it's clear to you, so people know that this is just a test server. So this server, it is connected out to the internet, but it's not actually being used for DNS. So a lot of things I'm going to do are not going to fully function because we have a different DNS server set up for actual live usage of the .dmarc.org domain. But this is just so I can show people how to create records and show you how these records are set up and defined. So we're going to use Windows DNS. So what you see here is the DNS, the screen here is the DNS manager. In the back here is just Office 365. So it's the portal.office.com and the admin portal. So I can just show you some of the things you can take from Office 365 as an example in terms of setting up and configuring this. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to set up SPF, right? So we're going to define what the SPF is for this organization. In this case, we have Office 365, and we're also actually have a mail server here as well. So we have an on-prem Exchange server. So how do I handle in this kind of situation? Since I have both and they're both actually sending out mail, this is what we do. So for SPF, remember, you can only have one SPF record per domain, right? So one SPF record per domain, and that SPF record, for the most part, is going to be a TXT record. There may be some third parties that will say, hey, use this CNAME record. That's fine, but you're going to have an SPF record as a TXT. That's going to be present in your environment. So now we don't have an SPF policy in place right now. There's nothing set up. So, but we do know we have a mail server and we have this Office 365. So what we're going to do is you're going to right click in your window, in your DNS manager, and you're going to choose other new record because we need to create a TXT file. So these are where it's going to list all the different resource record types you can create in DNS. We're looking for TXT, right? So we're going to create record, and this is where we're going to define what our record is. So if you remember for SPF, when we talked about it last week, for SPF, you leave this blank. There is no name because we wanted to use the actual domain name itself, .dmarc.org, right? The problem is though, because if you do put in like .dmarc or if you put in SPF, you're appending to the full domain name, right? As you can see down here. But for SPF, we're not using or defining anything for the name. We're only going to define the text, or the value is what's going to dictate what the SPF is going to be. So this is where we're going to put in V equals SPF1. Right now, I know we have mail exchanger records, so I'm going to put in MX, and then I'll go with tilde all for now. Right? I click on OK, done, and there's my SPF. Now, in this case, it's only using the MX records that are created here, right? But what Office 365 will say is like, no, also make sure you add some other values. So when I go into my Office 365 portal, right, if I go under domains, I look at .dmarc.org, under DNS records, it will tell you what are the records that you need to have in place. Right, so this is healthy because again, like I said, we're actually using a cloud service provider and all the records there are correct. But here you see it has V equals SPF1 include SPF protection.outlook.com. So what do I do here? So, I mean, do I copy this? Right, do I take all this information here? I'll do it this way. Do I copy this and then go in here and create a new record? Right, so is this, oops, that didn't copy it. You don't do it this way. That's not what you're supposed to do. You don't create a new record, right? Because you can only have one SPF. What you need to do is take your existing one and in here, add to this, include, right? What they tell you to include spf.protection.outlook.com. Right, this is what I'm going to do. So I just make sure here, include spf.protection.outlook.com. Okay. And their recommendation is put in the dash. So we'll dash. And you just hit apply. Okay. And now you've updated your SPF record. And that's what you're going to be doing. If you're using Salesforce, you just add it to this, include, and this might not be right, but salesforce.com, right? You're going to keep appending to this if you're using IP addresses, IP4, right, and so on. So everything you're going to do is you're going to add to this and you can apply to it because you can only have one SPF record, right? And here spacing matters. So make sure there's a space in between everything. Order, the only thing that matters in terms of order, V equals SPF1 first, and the all tag at the end, okay? So that's SPF, and that's you creating your SPF record. DKIM, so what do we do with DKIM? Now DKIM, again, remember from last week, it depends on what you're using. If you're using a third-party system, they could either have you create a TXT record or a CNAME record. If you're using on-prem servers, so you like an iReport, Mimecast, or you have to use a third-party tool for your MS Exchange, you're going to be creating a TXT record. Okay, so now with Office 365, Office 365 actually requires you to create CNAME records because they're going to be handling everything and they're the ones who are going to be responsible for everything. Right, so under domains, it doesn't tell you what it is. What you actually have to do is you actually have to go under an admin center. So depending on which view you have, if you're using the classic view, you go under Exchange. If you're using the new view, you actually go under Security because they moved the DKIM setting to Security and Compliance. So under here, you're going to go to Threat Management. Under Threat Management, you're going to have Policies, and under Policies, you have DKIM. Right? If you're using the classic view, under classic view, you have to go under Exchange. Under Exchange, you go to Protection, and under Protection, you'll find DKIM. Okay, so take that into account when you're doing this. Now, our DKIM setting is not 100% in the sense that when I go to .dmarc.org, I don't have DKIM keys saved for this domain. Right, and this is something that I've seen happen quite a lot for a lot of people who are using Office 365 and they have multiple domains in one instance. We actually have to do for this, and we're not going to go into this, is what you do is you actually use PowerShell, and in PowerShell you actually have to go in and connect to your Exchange Online You have to go in there and enable DKIM signing for your domain and so on and so forth. So if you go to our DMARC website, dmarc.global cyber alliance, we have resources there that tell you how to do it and the steps that you need to take in order to do this and enable it right here. Because otherwise what's supposed to happen is if I go to globalcyberalliance.org, you should see something like this, where you can go in and just enable your DKIM signatures. So for now, I'm just going to use this just to set an example of it. So pretend this says got.dmarc.org. Now, this still isn't going to work, right? This still isn't going to work because we don't actually have the DKIM records in place. So Office 365 requires that you have the records in place before you can implement this. So I'm going to turn on enable, and it's going to give me an error saying that these records don't exist. So these are the two records that it's going to define for you. But these are the names of the records. These aren't the actual values of the records. I'm not sure why they changed it. In the past, they actually gave you their values and not the names. So you actually have to go into your DNS and create those records. So in this case, since it's a CNAME record, right, what I have to do is right-click, choose new alias or CNAME, right, because CNAME is taking in one domain and redirecting it to another domain. So what we're going to do here is that the names, when you're using Office 365, the name is always selector1._domain key. This, you don't have an option. There's no choice. In fact, that's why they tell it to you, right? Selector1._domain key, right? But I'm not adding globalcyberalliance.org because in Windows, you don't do that, or got.dmarc.org. What you have to do is then define the fully qualified domain name. Now, the fully qualified domain name, when you're setting this up and creating it, it is going to always go selector. And don't worry about trying to remember this, right? Because we're on the Bootcamp page that we have created, we're going to have links to all these different resources to help guide you, so you can remember that, or you can just watch the video again. But where you're going to point to is selector one dash, because it's always selector one. The domain you're applying to, and that domain GUID that you're going to look at the email domain that they provide to you in your MX record. So got.dmarc.org. That's what's going to go next. So got.dmarc.org _domain key dot. And then typically what this domain here, what's going to be the rest of it is your initial domain that they provided to you when you created your account. So gca1.onmicrosoft.com, their default signing domain, right? Because that's the one that pertains to you and your domain. So gca1.onmicrosoft.com. So that's always going to be the case. That's always going to be the situation, how you set this up when you define this. All right. I'm going to create it twice. So create one. So with Office 365, it's always two. Whoops. There's always two. So one is going to be selector one and the other one's going to be selector two. Right? And that's what you do. So once you have these created, the records now are in place, then you can go back to here and, and click on the domain and then choose enable. Okay. In this case, again, it's still not going to work because this isn't an actual live DNS. So this isn't still not going to work in this situation. Okay. So that's the situation and that's the case, and that's where how you create it there. Now, well, that's fine. Now that everything here that we have is, we just created the DKIM keys and enabled DKIM settings for protection.outlook.com. But I still have this other server, mail.got.dmarc.org, right? So what do I do with this one? This is an on-prem server. We're not sending any of the information through Office 365, right? So if you're in the situation where you're sending off through Office 365, then you don't have to do this. But if you're not sending it through Office 365, then this is what you need to do. You need to download a tool called DKIM Exchange from GitHub. It's a free tool, free open source tool from GitHub. So I have it, we downloaded it here, we set it up. I just need to run it. So this configuration file, I run this. Again, this is going to error out because we don't have Exchange on here. This is just a simple standard test system that we have, but I can still show you everything. Right, so if you're actually installing this on a legitimate server, an actual Exchange server, it'll tell you what Exchange server is installed. It tells you all the information about it, tells you whether the DKIM signer is installed, and so on. But what I want to show you is under domain settings, right? Which we actually happen to have a domain. So let me just do this again. All right, so this is when you're using this for the first time, this is what you see, and this is where you're going to go and set up, right? Because this is where you're creating the key at this point now. So what we're going to do is we're going to click on add. We're going to define what domain we're creating the key for. So .dmarc.org. Whoops. Make sure you spell it correctly. That's going to be very critical. So .dmarc.org, that's your domain. That's the domain we're creating the key for. The selector, this name can be anything that you want. It could be a date, could be the, could be mail, because that's the certain name of the server. Just to make sure it's something that you know and what server is associated with. Here you can define the key length. So you can either be 1024 or 2048. So Windows DNS does support 2048, so you should be fine doing that. Right, and then you can generate a new key. Define where you're going to save the keys to. The keys must be saved in a secure location. So make sure wherever you end up putting it that only the appropriate people have access to it. Okay, so that's very important. So now this is your domain, the domain name that you're going to be using, mail._domainkey.dmarc.org. And this here, this text, all this text that's in this suggested DNS record, this is the value or the text that you're going to add to it. All right. So now in this case, it's not a CNAME, right? Because you're not pointing to a domain. There's no alias here. This is an actual value. So what you're going to be creating here is now a text record. So I'm going to choose other new records again. Scroll down, TXT, create record, and then here, put in the information, right? So for DKIM, it has to have a name. The name is going to be mail._domain_key, right? And then the domain is automatically appended. So you're not copying this whole thing. You're just going to copy the selector and the _domain key. Then the rest, this is the suggested record value. I'm going to choose copy to clipboard because I've made mistakes in the past where I'm not copying the whole thing. Because what people will do is they'll copy it, but they'll only go, they'll start from the bottom and go here. But guess what? You just missed this whole line here. So if you're using this tool, copy to clipboard, because that'll make sure that you have everything and you can paste everything in. Because if you're missing parts of it, now your information is correct and that's going to cause failures. So I click on OK, click done, and there you go. Now I have my domain key. And then over here on this side, you would click on save domain. You can also check it here. If this is a live DNS, I could actually click on check and it would check it and confirm it's in place. But since it's not live DNS, we can't check it. Right, so this is how you would DKIM key here. All right. So there's a question about key rotation. So in Office 365, what they have here is they have an option. So let me show you one that's actually this one that's working. So when you click on the domain, you can you actually have the option here to rotate DKIM keys. So you can rotate DKIMs. In terms of bumping it from 1024 to 2048, that you don't have that option. That's only that Microsoft makes that decision of what to have. Technically, what you can do is you can go into PowerShell, and in PowerShell you can force it to use 2048. But otherwise, it's Microsoft is handling everything in terms of the private key and public key for you. But yeah, PowerShell, there's workarounds in the PowerShell in order to do that. So this last step, yeah. So the one I just showed here with this tool, this tool here is only if you have on-prem Exchange, right? So you have an on-prem Exchange server, this is what you use, and on-prem meaning, that there's no gateway either. So right, you're not using a Cisco Iron Port, you're not using Mimecast. So if you're using like a Cisco Iron Port or Mimecast type server, do DKIM on that. Don't do it on each Exchange server, because this tool has to be installed on each and every single Exchange server, right? Even if you have a cluster, right? Because technically in a cluster, each server is still independent of each other, right? So you would have to install this Exchange DKIM signer on each and every single Exchange server. So if you have a gateway, best thing to do, you try to use that gateway if you can. And do you have to do this on a non-busy time? No, not really, because it's only going to go into effect as long as the public key is actually in place. You're not going to be able to turn this on until the public key is actually in place and recognized. This is include Exchange servers acting as relays. Yeah, you can actually do this on relays as well. All right, so that's a DKIM. So we have about 3 minutes left. So we're going to most likely go into overtime. There's 2 things I want to show you, not only just the DMARC policy. So to create a DMARC policy, so there's no wizard. I mean, there are online wizards you can go through and step by step. You know, GCA has one that's there as well that you can use to help guide you. But it's all it's going to tell you is to help you create the policy. But the first half of this session was showing you how to create the policy, right? So this is what we're going to do. So we have to create, right? We have to create a TXT record. So you scroll down, TXT, create the record, and this is where we're going to create our DMARC policy, right? So Office 365 is not going to tell you how to create the DMARC policy. In fact, there's nothing in Office 365 unless you go to their help guides and the TechNet sections of it. In there, they'll say something about DMARC and provide you guidance on what to do. But otherwise, they don't give you something specific, right? So I'm not going back into Office 365 now. I'm not going to touch it at this point. So what I'm going to do here is just create the record. So remember, the first requirement, you need a name. The name must be _DMARC. No ifs, ands, or buts about this. No choice. You have to use it, right? And your domain name is now, or the record name is now _DMARC.DMARC.org. And then under text, this is where you're going to create your policy. So V equals DMARC1, semicolon. P equals none, semicolon. Right? Those are the 2 tags that are required. That's the order of the tag. V first, P second. Then after that, RUA equals, because we want to get reporting. Otherwise, this is a useless policy if we don't have reporting enabled. So RUA equals mail to DMARC@DMARC.org, semicolon. And then we're going to also go ahead and put in the RUF tag. Equals, and it can go to this, we can send it to the same domain. That's fine. Semicolon. And that's all I need, right? At this point now, I have a DMARC policy. I'm good. I'm set to go. But hey, look, I'm looking at the reports and seeing people using subdomains, but well, we don't actually have any subdomains for email. So I'm going to add in SP equals reject, right? That's all you're doing. You're just making changes to this one file right here. So if I want to do if I want to say, okay, you know what? My DKIM records, my DKIM alignment always looks to be the same, so I can put in a DKIM equals strict. Right, so this is where you're going to make your changes. I'm ready to go to reject, so I'm going to, you can leave the SP tag in as a reject, but I'm just going to change this to reject. That's all you're going to be doing. So the majority of the time, the things you're going to be doing really is focusing on your SPF and focusing on creating all those DKIM records, and you're going to make minor changes to your DMARC policy when you go through and you set this up. Okay, so that's it. That's all it is for a DMARC and creating your DMARC policy. Now, so we talked about this in terms of the email aspect and the email side of it. So say that we don't have any email servers, right? So, I'm going to get rid of all of these. We don't have a mail server, so let's delete all of these, right? So what I can do is I can just put in a DMARC of reject and just leave it just like I have right here. I mean, of course, I need to send this to a different domain because this domain doesn't have email, right? So I can just go in here and change it to, globalcyber.org, obviously spelled correctly, right? But then I also what you should also do is you should also have a TXT record for your SPF, right? So what you want to make sure when you create an SPF record, and this is just in case people have SPF checking and not DKIM verification in place, what you do is just put in V equals SPF1 -all, and that's it. Right, so have a DMARC policy of reject, and then have SPF -all, and that way you're protected and you're protecting all your domains that are not being used. So all your public domains that are not using email. So this is your quickest way. I mean, you can get these and get them all done quickly at this point. So that's something you need to do to protect your domain and protect all the domains that you have that are not being used for email purposes. So all your public domains not being used for email, do this. B equals DMARC1, P equals reject. You know, I like to send the reports just to see in case if somebody ends up actually using it, and then SPF-all. SPF V equals SPF1-all. And that's how you're going to protect yourself and set it up in that way. So these are the different things. So we talked about how to create the SPF record, how to create the DKIM record, and how to create your DMARC records. All right. So let's go back to the slideshow just to quickly wrap up, and then I'll answer some of the questions that are there. So again, go ahead and implement DMARC at P equals none for your organization if you don't have a DMARC policy in place. So just as a reminder too, if you didn't have DMARC when we started the boot camp, and you do implement DMARC during the boot camp, at minimum at P equals none, you'll get an extra 3 credits added to your certificate. But as long as you attend all the sessions, so attend all the sessions plus the 3 if you implement DMARC for your domain at P equals none. But if you do have any questions in terms of the syntax or anything like that, you know, either email us or, you know, post it on the community forum, and we'll be happy to answer those questions. So again, as a reminder, there are 2 more sessions this week. The next 2 sessions, the first half will be the same. The second half is what's going to be different. So if you're interested, you're welcome to attend those. There's no restriction. We're not going to kick you out if you attended today and you want to attend the rest of these. So tomorrow, May 19th, we're going to show you how to implement SPF DKIM using bind. Right, we're not going to use the GUI version of bind. We're going to use command line, and then also on Cloud DNS. So if you're GoDaddy and GoDaddy, HostGator, I mean, we're going to be using Google Cloud Services, and we'll show also on one-on-one Ionis as well. But it's pretty much the same, you know, with the Cloud DNS providers. And then week 4 is going to be the reporting aspect of it. So all those questions about reports, I'm going to answer all those questions then. Unless you want answers earlier, then send me an email. But for now, I'm going to reserve those for next week. So again, I know we're 4 minutes over. If you want to still stay, you're welcome to stay while I answer these. There's a few questions here, not too many. It probably looks like about 5 or 6 questions. I'll go and answer those. If you can't stay, thank you again for joining, and we'll see you on the next session. So is there a difference between having an underscore domain key folder versus a selector ._ domain key record? So you always have to have a selector ._ domain key in your DNS. There's no option on that. It has to be selector, it has to be underscore domain key. Where you store your private keys, that's up to you. And the name of that folder is really up to you. So if the name of the folder is underscore domain key, then that's fine. But but the record name for the DKIM has to be that selector ._ domain key. I'm not sure if my question is proper, but are the locations where DNS record is hosted and the registrar matter in DMARC implementation? Like, for example, if the company registrar is at GoDaddy and the DNS record is hosted at Cloudflare, do we need to move all back to registrar? No. So you can buy your domain from GoDaddy, but if you choose to use Cloudflare as your DNS record or DNS hosting provider, then that's where your DMARC, SPF, DKIM, all that stuff is going to go there. So you don't have to switch back to GoDaddy. You just use Cloudflare for everything that you need to set up. Is there any known issues, bugs, or abuse that we should be aware of? Example, undelivered mails or bad report 8 emails. I haven't heard of any situation where you've got it that people have sent reports and it was like a fraudulent report or it came from a spam source or anything like that. Doesn't mean it can't happen, but I haven't seen or heard of any reports or any issues or abuse of situations when it comes to any of this. Criminals and attackers can technically use DMARC to protect their domain as well, and then allow messages to get through the DMARC verification process. But the problem is that now they've registered a domain. They have, it makes it easier to take down that domain because then now you know where to go to and what to target against. So external tools are to check for DKIM signing. So really, if you're using an email security gateway, those gateways should provide you with a DKIM verification option in there. If that's what the only thing you want to check for. I don't really recommend doing DKIM verification on its own because it tends to be a lot of issues and it's more difficult to determine what to do to the message because the message could come from a legitimate location, but they just for some reason don't have DKIM. The DKIM signature just didn't appear in that one message, or they didn't set it up correctly. So just be careful with those. So again, there's a lot of questions about analyzing RUA reports. I'm going to hold those off to next week, because we are over time. If you need to get those right away and you need to get those now, feel free to contact us directly or post the question on the community forum or send us an email, and I'd be happy to send you those lists. Otherwise, I'm gonna wait till next week to answer those questions. So there's a question about DKIM logs. So there are no DKIM logs. It's only DMARC logs. So DMARC reports that are generated. DKIM itself doesn't generate reports unless you have something for your own setup and configuration. But otherwise, there's no DKIM logging or setting anything like that. It's only DMARC. DMARC is the one that has DMARC reports, and in the DMARC reports will define what's going on with DKIM. So those DKIM reports, remember, they're going to come from the receiving side. So they're going to come in via email, and then you take those reports and you do what you need to do. Either import them into something, import them into a tool. If the SIM device can actually read DMARC reports, you can try to import it into those SIM devices. Right, so that looks like those are all the questions here. Again, the ones that I skipped are that have to do with reports, but that's for next week. So I'll thank you everyone for attending. Again, if you wish to attend the next 2 sessions this week, you're more than welcome to. Otherwise, we'll see you next week for week 4 and ongoing management and report analysis. Thank you everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are.